Welcome to Alif, Traditional Wisdom in Review. Alif is a digital media collective dedicated to publishing philosophically engaged content which brings together perspectives from both classical Islamic sources and the Western intellectual tradition. Our hope is to go beyond a model of mere dialogue and develop an approach focused on synthesis, the discovery of new relations, and the creation of points of integration. This podcast is part of a series where we interview the authors of the articles we publish to take a deeper dive into some of the information and topics they explored in their writing. Today, I am joined by author Garrett Maxwell to discuss his recent piece wherein he puts the metaphysics of the Qur'an in conversation with the philosophy of John Locke. Garrett situates Locke's thought as an example of modern individualist philosophy prone to the issue of solipsism. He contrasts this with the primal perspective of the Qur'an, which asserts a theophanic cosmos full of signs. Garrett is a student of comparative literature, Middle Eastern studies, and Arabic at Brigham Young University. Now here's our conversation. All right, salam. Welcome, everyone. You're listening to another in our series talking with our writers about the articles they published with Alif, and today I'm here with Garrett Maxwell to talk about his recent article, A Tale of Two Paradigms, Lockean Liberty and Quranic Cosmology. Welcome, Garrett.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So your article was a really interesting one, as all of our articles tend to be. This idea of bringing John Locke and Islamic thought together, especially through the Quran itself, very unique. So to start off with, for anyone who's not familiar, could you give us a bit of background on John Locke and sort of the substance of his philosophical thought?
Yeah, so John Locke is a famous philosophical figure for many reasons. So he's a 17th century British philosopher, and he's often considered to be the father of British empiricism, which is to mean that knowledge comes to us primarily through our sensory experience, and it emphasizes the role of empirical evidence in the formation of our ideas rather than innate ideas or traditions per se. He's also famous for his work on education, political philosophy, and religious tolerance. And so he's kind of a poster child of modern Westernism and individualism and liberty. So the vestiges of Lockean philosophy can be found everywhere, in the American Constitution, the right to bear arms and the right of the people to throw off tyrannical leaders. And of course, this more modern cosmopolitan idea of religious tolerance. He wrote a famous treatise called A Letter Concerning Toleration, wherein he outlines these ideas that we don't necessarily have to throw people in jail just because they believe differently than us. He's also famous for another treatise called Two Treatises of Government, which is his political theory involving the relationship of rulers and the people. And then the one that is most relevant to my essay here is the Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And in this one, he discusses how we are a tabula rasa, and that it's through experience that we gain knowledge. And he's a famous proponent that valorizes the rational mind, right?
So another important aspect that you brought into this article, drawing on more of Locke's sort of philosophical anthropology or even his ontology rather than the more political, social dimensions of his thought, is this idea of solipsism. So if you could expound a bit, what is this idea of solipsism in philosophy, and how is it connected to John Locke?
Yeah, and so I think the point of entry here is with Descartes, and it's the egocentric Cartesian worldview that turns out to be rich soil for the seeds of this solipsism. And it's what it is, it's defined as an extreme form of subjective idealism that denies that the human mind has any valid ground for believing in the existence of anything but itself, in its most extreme form. And so there's a famous problem of the other mind, as it's called, that demonstrates what it is, in that if we can only know what is in our own mind, how do we have any rational ground for knowing that minds outside of our own even exist? Or are the other people that we see around us, and reality itself, is that a product or a projection of our own solitary mind? And of course, there's no real proponents of this extreme form of solipsism, but it's a clear outgrowth of this Cartesian kind of worldview. So John Locke's connection with it, he's essentially an heir to Descartes in this philosophical strand because he was a pioneer of Western individualism, because he advocated not only privatization of property, but also of meaning itself. And as John Durham Peters explains in his magisterial history of the idea of communication, John Locke's concern was the sovereignty and the semantic liberty of the individual. And so what John Locke continued was this notion that the sovereignty of the solitary mind is ultimately necessary. So what John Durham Peters writes is that for Locke, the individual and not the society, language, or tradition is the master of meaning, which makes common ground between individuals both desperately urgent and highly problematic. And so this is where we run into trouble with the privatization of meaning and the sovereignty of the individual, is that once that is accomplished, now the problem becomes how to reach outside of the solitary individual and what they have determined, is reality and is truth.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of philosophical quandaries that pop up when you dive deep into these ideas of privatization of meaning, of solipsism. So from here, I'm curious, what was your inspiration for bringing together these sort of disparate topics of Locke's philosophical anthropology and the Quran's perspective on the human being, on meaning? What served as the inspiration to put these two together?
Yeah, good question. So I think that our modern kind of cosmopolitan attitudes have outpaced our actual knowledge of this world that is being brought together by globalization and some of the disparate intellectual traditions. And so in keeping with the mission of this journal, Alif, I think putting together Locke and the Qur'an was a great idea, because Locke is often seen as the poster child of this Western, modern, individualistic paradigm, and Islam and the Qur'an serve as a consistent foil for that paradigm and serves as a polemical target quite often. And so they seem to be two very apt representatives of a modern Western paradigm and what we kind of call an older or religious paradigm. And those kind of terms they're bandied about in discourse, but it's often that we don't actually know what those things mean. And so this was my attempt at kind of excavating some of the genealogy and some of the meaning of what we mean by a modern Western paradigm and what we might mean by an older, more traditional or religious paradigm.
So I think that serves as a perfect segue to talking about one of the other moving pieces in your essay here, and that's the framework that you utilized from Richard Tarnas, talking about the primal. So could you give a little bit of a background about this framework, how you employed it in this work, and perhaps how it contrasts to the modern perspective, as well as Jasper's idea of the axial?
Yeah, so Richard Tarnas, he's the author of quite a famous work by now called The Passion of the Western Mind, where he traces an intellectual history of the Western mind. And one of the next works that he wrote is called Cosmos and Psyche. And in the beginning of that book, he's concerned with elucidating what exactly the conflict between a primal and a modern worldview looks like and what it's grounded in. And so for him, the way he describes the primal worldview is that the primal world is essentially ensouled, and it communicates, it has purpose. And as he says, there's a continuity that extends between the interior world of the human and the world outside. It's pregnant, it's full of signs and meaning, and there's a kind of a creative and responsive intelligence, and it's everywhere. And the modern worldview, what it has done is relocated all meaning that previously was in the cosmos inside the individual. And so I took that to be a useful framework for what I'm trying to write about here. And so I actually ended up sending my essay to Richard Tarnas himself, and he kindly responded, and he had something interesting to say. And he said that he makes a distinction between what he calls the primal worldview or sensibility and the Quranic, seeing the latter as principally a later expression of the axial family of perspectives. And what that means is The axial family of perspectives posits or discloses the primacy of a radically transcendent divine dimension of being. And of course, there's always a continuity between these things, and so the Quranic worldview isn't necessarily not primal, but it is a later stage and a later development of that worldview. Because of any sacred text out there, the disclosure and primacy of a radically transcendent divine, that is the central message of the Qur'an, La ilaha illallah. And he recommended that I look at Robert Bella's seminal work, Religion and Human Evolution from the Paleolithic to the Axial Age. And what the Axial Age means is roughly the middle centuries of the first millennium BC. And what Robert Bella tells us is that though Christianity and Islam fall outside the Axial Age chronologically, they're only historically intelligible as developments of Israel's axial breakthrough. And so this term axial age kind of came into currency with Karl Jasper's book in post-war Germany, where he speaks of this time period where there's a sudden appearance of Confucius and Lao Tzu, Buddha in India, Zoroaster in Iran, prophets in Palestine, the philosophers, tragedians, and historians in Greece. And he believed that man, as we know it today, came into being in this axial age. It was a volatile time. Everything was in commotion. People were settling new lands, and it wasn't only people and geography in commotion, but it was also ideas. The older way of life was becoming more centralized, with the state and rulers. Yeah, so I found Richard Tarnas's feedback helpful in kind of modulating and modifying what I'd first proposed. And these ideas of axial and primal perspectives readily connect to the article by Muhammad Rustam that I cited about the great chain of consciousness, wherein Muslim metaphysicians also saw the contents of the entire universe as being alive. In Surah 13, verse 15, and unto God prostrates whosoever is in the heavens and the earth, willingly or unwillingly, as do their shadows in the morning and evening. Not only verses like that, but also the notion that the entire universe is a stage for the theophanies of God. And this is where we gained a little bit of fun Arabic etymology with the word ayah, which has a double meaning, wherein it means, one, the verses of the Qur'an, and also it means a sign. And so there's this metacosmic correspondence between creation, the Qur'an, and the human, which is what facilitates that eminent pervasiveness of meaning that both the primal worldview and the Qur'an are proponents of, is that no matter where you look, you will see a sign. You will see something with meaning embedded in it. And so I found that the primal worldview to be a useful framework for articulating these Quranic ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always so interesting when you're using these frameworks of broad historical periods. I mean, there's so much value to be gained from these things, but they're also always made with some emphases over others. And I almost wonder if the axial framework, when viewed through the Western developments, especially in terms of Christianity and the Greek philosophical heritage, if there's more of a break from the primal that Richard Tarnas describes. And then perhaps it seems to me that in the Islamic world, there's more of a synthesis or an integration with the primal and the axial. And I think this idea that you bring up of the signs in the cosmos, of the very theophanic nature of creation from the Islamic perspective, definitely seems to include this more primal perspective, even within it, as it has this broad two worlds mythology and the emphasis on a monotheistic, transcendent God that characterizes the axial thinking.
And you bring up a good point there about the monotheism. This was a point that I made in my essay, is that in the Lockean view, the point from which everything else begins is the solitary mind. It's the individual. That semantic liberty is inviolable. And in the Qur'an and many religious traditions, but especially the Qur'an, it is from God that all else flows. And so we have these very different originating points of reality. And that was one of the main points of friction that kind of emerged by putting these two together. Just another side note, while talking about the primal worldview, I know that sometimes that word primal has this connotation or a pejorative sense of something being primal as something being lesser or less intelligent, less developed, or not suitable for modern day life. And I just want to explain that when we talk about primal, we're talking about chronology, and that's it. What was primal is what came before, and there's no value judgment involved in using the word primal in modern. It's just merely terms used for identifying where we are on the chronological timeline of the history of humankind.
What you just mentioned was quite interesting, that there's this friction between the Lockean perspective and the broadly Islamic perspective you're painting here. But one thing I really appreciated about your article is you didn't set these things diametrically opposed to one another. And this will dovetail nicely into what you're going to be writing in the future on this topic. But could you talk a little bit about how you are perhaps trying to rehabilitate these two and show that they are not perhaps as opposed as one might initially assume, and how you're going to develop this in your next piece on the topic?
Yeah. So in order to write this, I did have to put them in a little bit of an opposition, which is kind of the common conception that these two worldviews are diametrically opposed. And, just like phenomenology itself, all scholarship is just anti-reductionism. What I'm trying to do here is accomplish just that in providing more nuance, more fully fleshed picture of both the Qur'an and Lockean philosophy in the background of Western individualism. As I was doing my research for this, I also noticed that there's some really interesting touchstones between the two, some very interesting common ground. One of my favorite verses in the Qur'an pops up quite a few times. One of them is in Surah 5, verse 48. It reads, "If God had willed, he would have made you one community, but his will is to test you with what he has given each of you. So compete with one another in doing good. To God you will all return. Then he will inform you regarding your differences." And so it seems to have this, what I might call a hermeneutic of diversity, in that as opposed to common Orientalist tropes or conceptions, that there's this tyranny of thought and epistemological tyranny in religion writ large and in Islam in particular. But what we find inside, if we look closely, is that it seems that God, of course, was aware of this from the beginning, and it was all intentional. The God in the Quran can do anything that he wills, and he could have willed to put everyone together into one uniform body of belief, one uniform way of seeing the universe, but did not. And there's purpose in that. And so, Locke himself was famous for being a proponent of religious tolerance. And so both of them have a basis from which to articulate those things. They might do it differently, but it's there in both of them. And John Locke also proved to be a more interesting figure than I first supposed as well. He has this really interesting piece of writing called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And Locke is very explicit in claiming that reason and revelation have identical implications. And as we've seen in Yusuf's essays or Yusuf's series on Islamic logic, that this is also a concept that was not lost on the Muslim philosophers and theologians, that reason and revelation have identical implications. And it's to reason that the Quran appeals in the very thrust of its revelation. It appeals to human reason to certify its veracity, right? Just like a lot of Muslim philosophers and theologians, John Locke thought that if God had given us these two avenues of belief, one revelation and one reason, that they ought not to conflict with each other if properly used. And this is an endeavor that he was a proponent of, and that the Quran is as well, I think. And in reading more about John Locke, it reminded me of Isaac Newton, the famous figurehead of the mechanical worldview, in that for so long he was this poster child of empirical rational science. But when we got digging into the archives of everything that he wrote, we found out that he'd actually written millions of words on topics such as alchemy, magic, and things that were kind of quite an embarrassment to the school of thought that propped him up as this paragon of reason. And it became this kind of quiet scandal. I find that very interesting because we want to whitewash these figures that have become a poster child of some modern scientism or logical positivism. And we want to erase the fact that they actually had sympathy for and had many touchstones with these older, primal religious worldviews, and oftentimes that's exactly what drove their advances that have propelled us into this modern technologically advanced world. And in the same way, John Locke is not a 2D character. He's certainly 3D in the same sense that Isaac Newton was.
So for just one example as well of a literary touchstone between John Locke and the Islamic tradition is in the famous novel Hayy ibn Yaqdhan by Ibn Tufayl.
And it seems that John Locke's famous idea of the tabula rasa was in fact taken from the idea of this Muslim philosopher from the 1100s. And so one of his very basic fundamental building blocks of the idea of educating oneself through empiricism and rational thought was built upon a concept expounded by a Muslim philosopher long before he did. And so there is this continuity, all the way from the Qur'an to John Locke, through the Muslim philosophers. And so it seems naive to paint the two as gladiators locked in mortal combat.
Well, thank you so much, Garrett, for exploring these topics with us. This was a fascinating conversation, and we certainly look forward to your next piece that will continue to develop these themes and present some underexposed connections. You have been listening to a conversation on the philosophy of John Locke and the Qur'an with Garrett Maxwell. Links to Garrett's piece can be found in the show notes. This podcast is produced by Alif Traditional Wisdom in Review. Thank you for listening.